Welcome to the channel. Today we turn our attention to the third great era, known as the Dvapara Yuga. In this episode, we will explore in detail the causes behind the decline of the universal order. We will trace how human society transformed and uncover the deep social and philosophical shifts that set the stage for the greatest crisis of the ancient world. Previously, we covered extensive lectures about the rulers of the lunar dynasty and the heroes of the Mahabharata epic. Building on that knowledge, today we will conduct a comprehensive overview of this era, examining the very fabric of time when righteousness began to give way to personal ambition and rituals became tools of political influence. I sincerely thank you for your support and thoughtful comments, which help develop the project and create new, in-depth content. Your interest in ancient history is our main motivation. Please make yourself comfortable as we begin our narrative. At the end of the Dvapara Yuga, the world underwent irreversible changes. Vedic texts tell us that the great ruler Rama, having restored order after his victory over the king of Lanka, passed governance of his prosperous kingdom to his successors and withdrew beyond the earthly realm, immersing himself in the waters of the Sarayu River. My name is Michael Reynolds. You're watching Ancient Secrets. Thanks for watching my content. I'd appreciate your subscription and like. Enjoy the video. With his departure, the dedication to honor and selfless duty that characterized the people of the past began to fade rapidly. Rulers increasingly sought to expand their territories, disregarding ancient non-aggression pacts. Indian cosmology describes this process through the metaphor of Dharma, which embodies universal morality. At the dawn of time, this bull stood firmly on four legs, symbolizing asceticism, purity, compassion, and truthfulness. But with the arrival of the Dvapara Yuga, it lost its second leg. The world was left with only half of its original spiritual stability. The balance between virtue and vice shifted toward material desires. Falsehood became a common tool in diplomacy, and greed rose to equal standing with devotion. The surrounding reality responded to these internal changes with physical transformations. Human lifespan steadily shortened, settling at around 1,000 years. Previously unknown ailments appeared in daily life. Texts mentioned fevers, joint weaknesses, and exhaustion. Physical fatigue became a constant companion, requiring extended rest after labor. Nature expressed its temper through natural disasters, droughts and floods that destroyed entire settlements. According to surviving legends, the climate demanded a completely new approach to survival. The favorable conditions of past eras gave way to sharp seasonal shifts, with cold winds and scorching sun. People had to invest great effort in building sturdier homes, using fired bricks and thick logs. There arose a need to design barns and granaries, to create long-term food reserves in case of poor harvests. The earth no longer yielded crops without hard labor, prompting the invention of metal farming tools, the development of complex irrigation systems, the domestication of draft animals, and the gradual reclamation of land from wild forests for cultivation. Alongside these physical challenges, Vedic society faced a decline in cognitive abilities. The unified spiritual knowledge, once grasped intuitively and retained effortlessly, became too complex for the human mind of the Dvapara Yuga. Generational memory faltered, shifting from a reliable storehouse to a fragile vessel. Priests began to forget the correct pronunciation of lengthy Vedic hymns. The transmission of traditions from teacher to student increasingly involved phonetic distortions. This caused great concern, as a mispronounced sound during a ritual could bring disaster upon an entire settlement. Disturbed sages gathered at sacred altars in the Himalayan foothills, seeking a solution. "O Creator," they prayed to Brahma, offering ghee to the sacrificial fires. The minds of people grow clouded, and memory weakens with each generation. How can we preserve sacred knowledge when the world loses its clarity and words lose their original power? If we fail to fix the truth, our descendants will wander in the darkness of ignorance. The gradual degradation of human consciousness reflects the concept of time in Hinduism, where entropy and the breakdown of order are natural cyclical stages of the universe's existence. The loss of intuitive understanding of nature's laws meant that people now needed external instructions. Whereas social harmony once rested on each individual's inner compass, there arose a need to record agreements, write down rules, and regulate behavior. This shift sparked the development of jurisprudence and governmental structures. Detailed codes emerged, defining trade regulations, dynastic marriages, water resource allocation, and inheritance procedures. The necessity to enforce these laws led to social stratification. Society divided into classes with rigid boundaries and narrow specializations. Some focused exclusively on memorizing texts, others took on tax collection and armed protection, while a third group provided material support through farming and craftsmanship. Amidst this division of labor and fading memory, the need arose to systematize spiritual heritage. To fulfill this task, the sage Vyasa appeared in the world. His birth story is detailed in ancient texts, beginning on a misty island in the middle of the Yamuna River. There, far from bustling settlements, a wandering ascetic named Parashara met a young ferryman woman named Satyavati, who transported travelers by wooden boat. From this union was born a boy with dark skin, named Krishna Dvaipayana, meaning dark one born on the island. Later he became known as Vyasa, meaning the splitter or the compiler. Folklore scholars interpret this figure as a symbolic fusion of profound spiritual asceticism and simple earthly nature, enabling the emergence of a person who could bridge the fading era of intuitive knowledge and the new age of strict rules. Having matured and undergone a long period of solitude, Vyasa recognized that the original Veda, a vast, unified body of knowledge, had become unmanageable for the human mind. People of the Dvapara Yuga were losing the ability to hold abstract concepts in their minds, their attention scattered by everyday concerns. The sage decided to divide this monolith into 4 structured parts, adapting the volume of knowledge to the limited capacities of his contemporaries. Thus, separate collections were formed. The Rigveda contains thousands of hymns addressed to natural forces. The Samaveda gathers ritual melodies and chants that set the proper rhythm for ceremonies. The Yajurveda consists of precise instructions and sacrificial formulas for altar rites. The Atharva Veda describes everyday spells, medical treatises, and magical practices for protecting the home. Each part was given a clear function, greatly simplifying the training of priests. After completing this extensive work, Vyasa gathered his most capable disciples in his forest hermitage: Pila, Vaisampayana, Jaimini, and Sumantu. Life in the hermitage followed a strict routine. Waking before sunrise, bathing in the cold river waters, maintaining the sacred fire, and spending long hours memorizing verses while seated on cushions made of kusa grass. The sage distributed the collected texts among the young men for preservation, solely through oral tradition. He understood that writings inscribed on wooden tablets or fragile palm leaves could easily be destroyed by accidental fires, washed away by seasonal floods, or deliberately altered by unscrupulous copyists serving the ruling elite. From that moment on, the truth would be concealed beneath layers of words. He strictly instructed his students in the sacred verses, passing on the holy syllables. Their task was to transmit every sound without distortion, for even the slightest error in a mantra could disrupt the harmony of the world and bring misfortune upon their entire lineage. However, Vyasa realized that the system he created was accessible only to a small circle of dedicated priests. For ordinary people, artisans, farmers, warriors, and women, whose minds could no longer grasp the complex Vedic philosophy in its pure form, a different approach was needed. For them, the sage composed historical chronicles, culminating in the grand epic that tells the story of the descendants of King Bharata. In addition, he compiled Puranas, which contained genealogies of rulers and descriptions of the creation of the universe. In these texts, profound truths about the cosmos, universal laws of justice, and codes of conduct were presented in the accessible language of stories and parables. Abstract concepts took shape in the images of heroes and rulers whose deeds served as clear examples of right or wrong choices. These stories were performed by traveling storytellers in city squares during festivals, becoming a primary tool for culturally uniting disparate tribes. The mystery of oral transmission in ancient India showcases the extraordinary abilities of the priestly caste. For many generations, Brahmins preserved vast amounts of information through strict mnemonic discipline. Training began in early childhood, and required repeated recitation of the same sound patterns. Under the guidance of a mentor, special mnemonic techniques were used, where words were memorized not only in their original order, but also in reverse, in pairs, and in a checkerboard pattern. Each spoken word was accompanied by specific movements of the head and hands, engaging muscle memory. The text became a mathematically precise sound matrix. The process of simplifying and cataloguing knowledge in the sacred verses can be seen as an early form of information systems. When a society faces an excess of data it cannot process, there arises a need for strict organization. Knowledge ceases to be a common heritage freely available to all and becomes the privilege of a narrow group of specialists. Brahmins monopolized the right to recite sacred hymns, further deepening social stratification. Even the simplest ritual now required the presence of a qualified priest. Kings and wealthy landowners were compelled to offer large herds of cattle, gold, and fertile lands as payment for correctly pronounced mantras. The well-being of the state and the ruler's connection to higher powers became entirely dependent on an intermediary who mastered the precise intonation. This transition firmly established new social rules, where formal ritual performance began to overshadow its inner meaning. While the priestly caste strengthened its position and monopolized access to knowledge, significant political changes were underway. The Solar dynasty, whose rulers had for centuries relied on impeccable duty and asceticism, gradually receded into the background. The initiative passed to the Lunar dynasty, whose ancestors were associated with the deity Chandra. Scholars generally agree that this shift in power reflects a transformation in societal consciousness. If the descendants of Surya symbolized unchanging law, then the followers of the lunar cult brought changeability, diplomatic flexibility, and susceptibility to earthly passions. The story of the Lunar dynasty's origins is marked by conflict. As mentioned in the lecture on the moon god, Chandra abducted Tara, the wife of Brihaspati, mentor of the gods. This event sparked a war between the gods and the demons. From this forbidden union was born Buddha, the protector of the planet Mercury. Later, Buddha allied with Ila, daughter of Manu. Their offspring, King Pururavas, became the first earthly ruler of the Lunar dynasty. Thus, rebellion against authority and the dominance of personal desire over duty are embedded in the roots of this lineage. Pururavas combined intellect, diplomatic cunning, and an insatiable thirst for sensual pleasures that often overshadowed reason. The life of this monarch changed forever after meeting the celestial nymph Urvashi. According to the Rig Veda, the king saw her on the riverbank and was captivated by her grace. The heavenly maiden agreed to become the wife of the earthly king, but set two conditions. First, he must protect her beloved sheep and guard them as his most precious treasure. Second, the king must never appear before her unclothed. For many years, the couple lived in harmony in the palace of the earthly ruler. Pururavas built pavilions for his wife, surrounded by gardens with exotic trees and ponds, where they spent time away from prying eyes. However, the inhabitants of the heavenly realms grew concerned over Urvashi's prolonged absence. The Gandharvas, celestial musicians, decided to bring her back by trickery. One night, they entered the inner courtyard and stole one of the sheep. Hearing the noise, Urvashi awakened her husband. "My protector," she said in the dark bedroom, "thieves are taking my treasure while you sleep. Can the ruler not defend his home and keep his word?" Stung by the reproach, Pururavas sprang from his bed, forgetting to cover himself, and rushed to the door. At that moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the room. Urvashi saw her husband naked. The agreement was broken, and the celestial maiden instantly vanished, leaving the king alone. Pururavas left the capital and set out on a journey. He wandered through forests and mountains, appealing to trees, rivers, and birds to guide him to his lost wife. The Mahabharata describes this episode as a period of mental anguish. The king abandoned state affairs, forgot his subjects, and surrendered entirely to his grief. After some time, he found Urvashi at the lake Kurukshetra, where she played with other nymphs in the form of waterfowl. "Return to me," pleaded the earthly ruler, standing knee-deep in water. "My kingdom is empty without you, and my mind refuses to serve me. I no longer belong to your world." Urvashi, revealing her true form, replied, "My nature is like the wind. It cannot be confined within stone palace walls. Return to your duties, earthly king, and do not seek solace in illusions. Despite her refusal, the Gandharvas took pity on the ruler. They taught him how to kindle the sacred fire by rubbing together 2 wooden sticks made from the fig tree. This ritual allowed him, after completing his earthly journey, to reunite with his beloved in the heavenly realms. In the context of studying the Dvapara Yuga, this myth illustrates a social shift. The breaking of the bond between the monarch and the celestial maiden symbolizes the final separation of the human world from the divine realms. Direct, open communication with the divine becomes impossible. A veil descends between the 2 worlds, which can only be crossed through complex, multi-stage rituals and priestly mediation. Humanity is left alone with its ambitions and weaknesses. The political climate of the new era was shaped by compromises. Kings of the lunar dynasty began to test the limits of what was permissible. Their nature combined cold calculation with uncontrollable desires. They broke ancient taboos, formed contentious alliances, and sought to subjugate not only neighbouring tribes, but even the laws of nature themselves. Their focus shifted from inner self-perfection to territorial expansion and resource accumulation. This shift from contemplation to decisive external action set the course for civilization's development for the next 1,000 years. The machinery of the state began to serve the ambitions of the ruling elite. Power for its own sake became the norm. Rulers no longer sought the approval of higher powers for every decision. Instead, they relied on military strength, fortified cities, and diplomatic maneuvering. The world gradually descended into an era of pragmatism, where ancient ideals gave way to political expediency. During this time, the figure of King Yayati emerged prominently on the political stage, his story vividly illustrating the changing worldview. This ruler, son of the powerful Nahusha, managed to unite vast territories under his control and dominate key trade routes in his region. According to the texts of the Mahabharata, Yayati married Devayani, daughter of the teacher of the Asuras, Shukracharya, while secretly forming a relationship with Sharmishta, daughter of the leader of hostile tribes. When his lawful wife discovered the breach of marital vows and the birth of children from the rival, she immediately left the palace and sought protection from her father. Enraged, the Brahmin imposed a curse on the king, premature aging. The texts describe how the king's body instantly weakened. His skin became deeply wrinkled, his hair turned grey, and his mind began to dull under the sudden weight of advancing years. "O great mentor," Yayati addressed Shukracharya, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. "My desires remain unsatisfied. I have not yet enjoyed the fruits of my reign, the palace musicians' melodies, or the wealth accumulated through years of warfare. I beg you, soften your punishment." The sage's mercy proved unusual. He allowed the king to transfer his infirmity to anyone who would willingly exchange their youth for it. Yayati returned to the capital, summoned his 5 sons, and offered them the burden of his curse. The elder sons, including Yadu and Turvasu, firmly refused to sacrifice their years for their father's ambitions. They presented reasonable arguments, noting that old age destroys attractiveness, deprives a person of respect, and makes governing impossible. Only the youngest son, Puru, agreed to accept his father's infirmity out of a sense of filial duty. Renewed in strength, Yayati resumed ruling the empire with doubled energy. For 1,000 years, he continuously increased the treasury, built magnificent palaces, and indulged in various pleasures. The royal residences of that era were complex architectural ensembles with artificial ponds, shaded gardens, and spacious halls for feasts. Rare goods flowed into the capital from all corners of the continent: fine fabrics, precious metals, and exotic spices. Historians still debate whether the metaphor of Yayati's 1,000-year reign represents the actual chronology of a dynasty passing down his name, or if ancient authors encoded a period of significant economic prosperity under this symbol. Regardless of interpretation, this story is crucial for understanding the spirit of the Dvapara Yuga. Society had reached a level where accumulating wealth and seeking pleasure became the ruling class's main goal. An illusion arose that unlimited power and vast resources could conquer time itself and the laws of nature. King Yayati used his son's youth as expendable material, turning another's life force into a tool to prolong his own comfort. This approach became typical for many rulers of the period. They systematically depleted natural resources, imposed heavy taxes on the population, and waged expansionist wars, showing little concern for the state in which the world would be left to their descendants. The moral decline was accompanied by deep social stratification. While the elite drowned in luxury, ordinary people were forced to serve their ever-growing demands. Craftsmen created increasingly refined household items. Jewelers worked on intricate multi-tiered ornaments made of gold and precious stones, while architects designed multi-level residences with complex water supply and ventilation systems. The growing demand for luxury goods stimulated the development of trade routes connecting remote regions of the subcontinent. Merchants organized large caravans that crossed dense jungles and wide rivers to deliver incense, sandalwood, and ivory to the palaces. The economic engine operated at full capacity, demanding a constant influx of new resources and territories. However, Yayati's experience ended with a profound realization about human desires. After 1,000 years of relentless pursuit of pleasure, the king found that his inner dissatisfaction had only multiplied. Accumulated wealth did not bring the expected peace, and absolute power did not relieve the emptiness within. "My son," Yayati said, restoring Puru's rightful youth and reclaiming his own wrinkles, "I have explored the limits of human capability and learned one unchanging truth. The fire of desire cannot be quenched by endlessly feeding it. The more one receives, the stronger the thirst for new acquisitions becomes. I return your strength along with the throne, for only one who can control their desires is worthy to rule." This myth establishes a fundamental philosophical principle of Vedic culture and reveals the deep systemic crisis of the Dvapara Yuga. Civilization began to recognize the destructive nature of endless consumption. Forest thinkers of the time recorded in their treatises that material progress without inner discipline inevitably leads to personal degradation. Yet the ruling elite was mostly unwilling to abandon their comfortable lifestyles. Monarchs preferred to ignore the sages' warnings, passing the consequences and accumulating karmic debts onto future generations of rulers. As the inner spiritual core of rulers weakened, Vedic civilization began to seek support in external forms of worship. With diminishing personal spiritual strength, society in the Dvapara Yuga increasingly relied on elaborate rituals known as yajnas. Where once sincere meditation and simple offerings sufficed to communicate with higher powers, now fire sacrifices became state projects demanding vast resources. Preparation for royal rituals could take months or even years. A notable example was the Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice, which lasted an entire year and involved thousands of artisans, carpenters, and jewelers preparing offerings. A specially selected stallion, accompanied by an armed escort, roamed neighbouring lands freely, and any territory it entered was declared the property of the king sponsoring the ritual. This practice inevitably provoked armed conflicts with neighbours, turning religious ceremonies into tools of aggressive foreign policy. Central to these ceremonies was the construction of brick altars. The most famous was shaped like a flying bird, symbolising the soul's ascent to the heavens. Creating such structures required precise mathematical calculations. Builders used thousands of fired bricks of exact size and shape. The firing process required strict control of temperature, and the bricks were laid in multiple layers, following precise geometric plans, with each element carrying symbolic meaning. Some scholars believe that the need for exact calculations in constructing these complex ritual structures spurred the development of ancient geometry and astronomy. The ceremony itself was no longer entrusted to a single individual. Hundreds of specialized priests participated, each responsible for a specific part of the ritual. The division of duties among the priests was meticulously organized. The chief priest recited hymns from sacred texts, inviting the divine beings to descend to the altar. A second priest chanted melodies from ancient scriptures, creating the necessary sound vibrations. A third priest carefully monitored the physical actions, measuring the exact quantity of clarified butter and pouring it into the sacred fire at designated moments. A fourth priest, possessing the deepest knowledge, sat aside silently, observing the ceremony to detect and correct any possible errors through cleansing chants. Pay attention to every sound and every movement. the chief priest instructed his young apprentices before the multi-day ritual began. Even the slightest mistake in pronunciation or an incorrectly measured handful of grain could disrupt the harmony of the ceremony and turn its power against the ruler. In our time, the divine demands flawless execution of the ritual form. This bureaucratization of spiritual life is a clear sign of systemic changes sweeping the era. When a society loses the original essence of a tradition, it begins to obsessively cling to its outward form, creating endless rules, regulations, and prescriptions. Mastery of correct ritual performance became a powerful tool of influence. The priestly class monopolized the right to communicate with higher powers, leading to irreversible shifts in the social structure. Originally, the social order was based on individual talents and qualities. However, during this age, it began to take on the characteristics of a rigid hierarchy. Moving from one social group to another became nearly impossible. The son of a craftsman was expected to continue his father's trade, learning metalworking or pottery without the option to change professions. Farmers became tied to their land, providing food for growing cities. Brahmin children prepared from an early age to take their parents' places at the altars, memorizing thousands of verses. Social boundaries were enforced by strict laws limiting marriages between groups and regulating even communal meals. Society fragmented into closed circles, each zealously guarding its privileges and craft secrets. Concentration of ritual power in the hands of a select few led to inevitable tensions between social classes. At the top of the social pyramid, a constant conflict arose between the priestly Brahmins and the ruling warriors. Kings and military leaders held real military power, controlled tax collection, and governed vast territories. Yet they were entirely dependent on the priests for legitimizing their authority. No monarch could ascend the throne, declare war, or conclude peace without the proper ceremony and official blessing. The Brahmins, lacking armies of their own, exerted influence through a complex system of religious rules and taboos. They could refuse to perform rituals for an unfavorable ruler, which, in the eyes of the people, invalidated his authority. Ambitious warrior leaders of the lunar dynasty often challenged this order by interfering in spiritual matters and supporting loyal thinkers. This rivalry between the two upper classes shaped the political life of the era, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. The state apparatus grew more complex, accumulating new departments and regulations, while the gap between common people and the ruling elite widened rapidly. The economic model underwent radical transformation, requiring the exploitation of entirely new resources. Infrastructure development brought large-scale changes to the landscape. Small forest settlements that once met the needs of the people gave way to large, fortified cities. Urbanization was driven by population growth and the need to protect accumulated wealth. Cities were built according to geometric principles developed by experienced architects. Settlements were surrounded by high stone walls, deep water-filled moats, and massive watchtowers designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Inside, cities featured complex architectural layouts. Wide stone-paved avenues divided the space into orderly sectors. Separate quarters housed blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and jewelers, whose workshops operated from dawn till dusk. At the city centre stood multi-level palaces surrounded by shaded gardens, gathering squares, and artificial ponds where lotus flowers bloomed. Life in such cities followed a strict schedule, monitored by city guards and market overseers. Translations of ancient texts mention the use of iron tools, marking a technological breakthrough. Access to iron ore deposits and advances in metallurgy allowed the production of durable implements. To feed the urban population, rulers began systematically clearing primeval forests that had covered much of the continent for centuries. Heavy iron axes made it possible to fell trees and clear land for cultivation. Ploughs with iron blades, pulled by oxen, allowed deep tilling of hard soil, increasing yields and expanding farmland. The shift from nomadic herding to settled agriculture required irrigation systems. Farmers formed cooperatives to dig extensive canals, diverting river water to fields. Earthen dams and reservoirs collected rainwater during monsoons. This ensured stable harvests of wheat, barley and rice, even in dry months, creating surpluses stored in royal granaries for times of famine or prolonged warfare. expansion into new territories rarely occurred peacefully. Farmers moving into dense forests often clashed with indigenous tribes who had lived in harmony with nature for centuries, relying on gathering and hunting. These native inhabitants saw forest clearing as desecration. They defended their lands with ambushes on settler caravans, burning crops and destroying newly built villages. Such resistance forced rulers to deploy regular troops to protect expanding borders. Military campaigns against forest tribes often ended with the subjugation of survivors, who were then compelled to work on city fortifications. Alongside agriculture, interregional trade flourished. Rivers like the Ganges and Yamuna became busy transport routes. Merchants equipped large vessels to carry grain, textiles, metals, incense, and spices between distant regions. The rise of regular trade led to the emergence of a wealthy merchant class. Though they lacked the political power of warriors or the spiritual authority of priests, merchants controlled material wealth. They formed trade guilds that set prices, regulated the quality of crafts, and minted their own coins. These associations began to play a significant role in the economies of the states, providing loans to rulers for waging wars and financing the construction of inns for travelers. The shift to a settled lifestyle and the accumulation of wealth demanded the establishment of a legal framework. The concept of private property became the cornerstone of social stability. There arose a need to regulate in detail the rights to land ownership, the distribution of water resources and irrigation channels, as well as the rules of inheritance for family estates. State judges and appointed officials handled daily disputes over land boundaries, unpaid debts, and breached trade agreements. Laws grew increasingly complex, constantly expanding with new amendments, exceptions, and legal precedents. The bureaucratic apparatus expanded, collecting taxes on every produced good and every ploughed field. The legal system gradually moved away from its original principles, becoming a tool to protect the interests of the wealthy class. The concentration of resources in the capitals created conditions for changing the nature of military conflicts. While in earlier times tribes fought over pastures and herds, now the capture of another city became a far more attractive goal than years of labour clearing wild lands. Palaces overflowing with gold, granaries stocked with grain, and quarters filled with artisans lured rulers. War gradually lost its sacred meaning, ceasing to be a means of restoring justice and turning into a profitable economic enterprise. Driven by greed and the desire to expand their influence, rulers began weaving diplomatic intrigues. They formed temporary alliances to jointly attack neighbours, setting off a chain reaction of mutual claims. The pursuit of dominance displaced concern for the well-being of subjects. Monarchs maintained standing armies that required regular supplies of weapons and provisions. Warriors, who previously returned to peaceful labour after campaigns, now became professional mercenaries, ready to fight for whoever offered the most silver. Amid the growing power of absolute monarchs, a different path unfolded for territories on the periphery of the Vedic world. The emergence of this alternative political system is directly linked to a prolonged conflict within the ruling house of the lunar dynasty. According to ancient Vedic texts, the eldest son of King Yayati, named Yadu, categorically refused to accept the burden of his father's premature aging. At that time, physical youth was associated with the ability to fully perform the duties of a ruler, and transferring one's life force was considered the highest filial duty. Yadu's refusal broke the established tradition of unquestioning obedience to the patriarch's will. In response, the angry king publicly deprived his eldest son of the right to inherit the central throne. "Your descendants will never crown themselves as supreme emperors," Yayati declared before the assembly of court priests. "From now on, your fate is to wander the outskirts, content with the status and wealth of scattered tribes, while other lineages shape the continent's destiny and conduct great sacrifices." Exiled, Yadu and his few supporters were forced to leave the settled lands of the central region. They moved toward the southern and western borders, where dense forests stretched across deep river valleys. From this exiled prince originated the powerful clan of the Yadavas. Over several generations, they slowly settled new territories, clearing land for pastures and erecting temporary fortified camps. Gradually, their paths led them to the fertile region of Shurasena, located along the banks of the Yamuna River. Denied the chance to compete for the title of supreme ruler, the Yadavas focused their efforts on entirely different aspects of state building, avoiding direct involvement in the affairs of the central empires. They preferred to remain in the shadows of the forests, methodically strengthening their borders and developing an independent economy. While other powers exhausted their human and material resources in endless territorial disputes, this clan steadily built a sustainable economic base. They were the first to recognize the strategic importance of trade routes linking the northern plains with southern seaports. Caravans of merchants transporting rare spices, cotton textiles, incense and precious stones inevitably passed through their lands. The Yadavas organized secure way stations, charging moderate tolls for protecting trade routes from bandits. This system ensured uninterrupted goods delivery and attracted increasing numbers of traders from across the continent. Special attention was given to the breeding and selection of cattle. The extensive floodplains of the Shurasena region allowed for the maintenance of herds numbering in the thousands. Among the Yadavas, the number of healthy livestock became the primary measure of social status. These animals provided the tribes with dairy products, durable leather for armor, and reliable draft power for working the fields. Alongside cattle breeding, the Yadavas began actively developing mineral deposits. In the foothills, they mined copper and iron ore, establishing their own craft centers for producing agricultural tools and weapons. Over time, this isolated clan accumulated wealth far exceeding the reserves of the central monarchies. Their small forest settlements transformed into major trading hubs with developed infrastructure. However, despite their growing economic influence, the Yadavas remained faithful to their ancestral curse. They did not attempt to proclaim themselves an empire and formally recognized the suzerainty of more aggressive neighbors, paying symbolic tribute to maintain peace along their borders. Historical isolation and the specifics of their economic activities shaped a unique political structure. Unlike the highly centralized states ruled by absolute monarchs, the Yadavas coordinated their actions through a council of elders. This system offers a rare example of an early form of oligarchic republic. Power was distributed among the heads of several noble clans, among which the Vrishni, Anthaka, Fodji and Kukura stood out. Each clan controlled a specific territory and had its own armed retinue. Yet in matters of foreign policy, they presented a united front. All key decisions regarding declarations of war, peace treaties, trade quota allocations, or the construction of new defensive structures were made by consensus. The clan leaders regularly gathered in a spacious assembly hall known as the Safa. In this chamber, every full member of the council had the opportunity to express their position. The discussion of contentious issues could last for many days, until the elders found a solution acceptable to all parties involved. The absence of a single ruler made it nearly impossible for one person to seize power, protecting the society from internal tyranny. This political model vividly demonstrates the diversity of governance forms during the Dvapara Yuga. It shows how economic dominance can successfully exist apart from formal imperial authority. The Yadavas proved to their contemporaries that a state's prosperity depends not only on constant military expansion, but also on the wise use of geographical position, the development of trade communications, and the ability to find compromises within the ruling elite. Their historical experience became an important stage in the evolution of social institutions, laying the groundwork for the emergence of complex republican formations capable of challenging traditional monarchies. While confederations were building their economic strength, traditional monarchies rapidly descended into deep political crises. Toward the end of the Dvapara Yuga, the situation in these states reached a critical point as rulers completely lost their connection to Dharma. Monarchs began to see their realms not as trusts handed down by their ancestors, but as personal, untouchable property. The duties of protecting their subjects, which had once formed the foundation of Kshatriya rule, were pushed aside. Power concentrated in the hands of ambitious dictators, willing to commit any moral or legal transgression to maintain control. Ancient codes of honor were forgotten, replaced by calculation and political intrigue. The state apparatus began serving only to enrich the ruling elite, ignoring the needs of the common people. A striking example of this decline is Kamsha, an ambitious heir to the throne in the prosperous city of Mathura. Impatient to wait for a natural succession, he orchestrated a coup and overthrew the legitimate ruler. Kamsha imprisoned his own father, stripping the old king of privileges, his retinue, and voice in governance. Establishing a regime of terror, the new ruler refused to rely on traditional militias or the loyalty of his subjects. Instead, he formed a vast mercenary army, paying professional warriors from neighbouring regions at the expense of the depleted city treasury. With these forces, Kamsha systematically suppressed any dissent, eliminating discontented aristocrats, confiscating their ancestral lands, and imposing unbearable taxes on farmers. To strengthen his position internationally, the ruler of Mathura forged strategic alliances with aggressive tribes and neighbours, violating the laws of diplomacy and ancient hospitality. He married 2 daughters of King Jarasandha, securing military support from one of the most powerful monarchs of the time. Riding on this strong alliance, Kamsha transformed his state into a military camp. Secret informants monitored every careless word spoken by citizens, and the city guard had the authority to detain any suspicious traveller without explanation. Traditional assemblies of elders were abolished as unnecessary. Priests were forbidden to conduct large-scale rituals without palace approval, and all trade routes came under strict control of armed detachments. The climax of the tyrant's paranoia was linked to his own sister, Devaki. According to ancient texts, on the day of her wedding to Prince Vasudeva, Kamsha personally oversaw the festivities, publicly displaying his familial affection. At that moment, a disembodied voice from the heavens foretold the ruler's inevitable death at the hands of Devaki's 8th son. Hearing this prophecy, Kamsha lost control. He grabbed his sister by the hair and drew his sword, intending to end her life before the shocked crowd. Only the persistent pleas of the courtier, who vowed to voluntarily give the tyrant every newborn child, convinced Kamsha to lower his weapon and reconsider. The newlyweds were sent not to the palace, but to a dungeon, where they spent many years in chains under constant guard. Fearing for his power, the ruler coldly destroyed the first 6 children born to Devaki. He personally descended into the dungeon, took the defenseless infants from their weeping mother, and ended their lives in a brutal manner. "Your blood will not justify my downfall," Kamsha declared, brandishing his sword before his sister in chains. Power brooked no sentimentality, and anyone threatening the throne would meet their end immediately. From a modern perspective, Kamsha's figure embodies a systemic failure of monarchy during the Dvapara Yuga. This mythological story clearly shows how a ruler becomes the chief oppressor of his people, using the state machinery solely to maintain control and amass wealth. The traditional Vedic system envisioned the king as a reliable protector of the weak and a guarantor of impartial justice. Yet in the fading era, this ideal was completely shattered. Rulers acted out of selfish motives, disregarding the karmic consequences of their deeds. Constant fear of losing power drove political decisions, pushing aside prudence, diplomacy, and compassion. Such tyrannies arose everywhere, turning once prosperous regions into zones of fear and hopeless oppression. Monarchs, blinded by illusions of absolute authority, systematically destroyed fragile trust between social classes. Brahmins, stripped of state support and protection, were forced either to serve dictators, justifying their crimes, or to hide in remote forest settlements. Farmers abandoned their fields under unbearable levies, and artisans left major cities seeking safer places to live. Economic ties between regions began to collapse, replaced by isolation and mutual distrust. This reflected a deep moral decay among the ruling class. The accumulated injustices and suffering of millions disrupted the cosmic balance so severely that restoring order by traditional human means became impossible. The situation demanded immediate intervention by higher powers, capable of halting the spread of chaos and restoring society to forgotten laws of Dharma. This was the role taken on by Krishna, who accepted the heavy task of restoring lost equilibrium. Spending his early years in the pastoral settlement of Vrindavan, far from palace intrigues, the grown youth returned to Mathura. He freed the city from Kamsha's oppression, breaking the chain of brutal repression. The usurper was killed, and the rightful ruler, Ugrasena, was restored to the throne. However, removing one tyrant did not bring instant peace, but sparked a new, even larger conflict. On the political stage emerged King Jarasandha, a powerful ruler of Magadha and father-in-law to the deposed Kamsha. Learning of the captivity of his daughters, Jarasandha assembled a vast army and marched it to the walls of Mathura. According to ancient texts, the Magadhan forces besieged the capital of the Yadavas 17 times. These repeated campaigns steadily drained the region's economy. Each assault was accompanied by destruction of crops, theft of livestock, and disruption of trade routes. The city's defenders showed resilience, repelling superior forces time and again. Yet constant mobilization deprived farmers of the chance to tend their fields, and artisans of the ability to produce goods. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, and ordinary citizens lived in continuous tension, awaiting the next siege. Assessing the geopolitical situation, Krishna concluded that a prolonged positional war was futile. Jarasandha's resources allowed him to replenish losses and raise new regiments, while the Yadavas were confined within their region, isolated and without hope of external aid. Bearing responsibility for the survival of his people, Krishna made an unprecedented strategic decision. He abandoned the defense of the exhausted lands of Surasena and ordered the entire Yadava clan to leave their ancestral territories. This required complex and painstaking organization involving all members of the ruling family. Tens of thousands gathered their possessions, loaded them onto carts, and set out on a long migration westward toward the Arabian Sea coast. The journey passed through dense forests, mountain passes, and arid plains. Leaving the capital to the enemy was seen by the warriors as a disgrace. Yet Krishna insisted that preserving the people was more important than holding on to stone walls. When Jarasandha's forces approached Mathura once again, they found only empty streets and abandoned homes, losing the chance to claim a decisive victory over their foe. True strength of a ruler lies not in stubbornly clinging to a piece of land. Krishna addressed the Council of Elders during a rest stop, calming the murmurs of discontent among the military leaders. Our mission is to ensure the safety of our families and the continuation of our lineage. We will build a new home where Jarasandha's swords cannot reach us, with the sea as our chief defense against any invasion. Upon reaching the western coast of the Saurashtra Peninsula, the settlers discovered that there was not enough suitable land for construction. According to mythological tradition, Krishna appealed to the ocean deity in a crow's form, asking the waters to retreat and reveal part of the seabed. On this reclaimed land, the divine architect Vishvakarma built Dwarka, a city unparalleled in the architecture of its time. Dwarka was designed to be both an impregnable fortress and a thriving commercial hub. At the heart of the settlement stood the assembly hall, Sudama, where the Council of Elders made state decisions. There is an intriguing hypothesis that the city's layout was based on advanced mathematical calculations, far ahead of its era. Contemporary observers marveled at Dwarka's geometrically precise structure. Wide avenues intersected at right angles, forming a clear grid of neighborhoods. The city was divided into specialized zones. Administrative buildings were separate from artisan workshops and residential areas. Luxurious royal palaces towered over spacious squares. For security, the city was surrounded by deep moats connected to the sea and high walls with massive gates. Special attention was given to infrastructure development. Deep water harbours were constructed, capable of receiving large trading vessels year-round. The founding of Dwarka radically shifted the trajectory of the Yadava clan. By moving the capital to the coast, they gained control over maritime trade routes, linking the Indian subcontinent with distant civilizations. Trade in spices, textiles, and precious metals quickly filled the treasury of the new state. The Yadavas became a powerful maritime power, with economic influence surpassing that of traditional land empires. This strategic move allowed Krishna to shield his people from aggressive neighbours and create a prosperous, economically independent enclave at the edge of the known world. The utopian image of flourishing Dwarka stood in stark contrast to the growing chaos on the mainland. While rulers of central states continued to exhaust each other in endless territorial disputes, the Yadavas enjoyed stability and economic growth. Dwarka became the last bastion of order, a safe haven before the gathering storm. However, complete isolation could not last forever. Dynastic ties, marriage alliances, and old mutual obligations gradually drew the inhabitants of the western coast into a tangled web of political intrigue. These developments inexorably pushed Vedic society toward a large-scale global confrontation, which, given the realities of the fading era, was impossible to avoid. While monarchs prepared for upcoming battles, concentrating resources in fortified capitals, other processes unfolded far from the noisy palace squares. The intellectual elite, observing the decline of morality and the bureaucratization of religion, began to feel deep disappointment in traditional forms of belief. Outstanding thinkers, priests, and even some rulers, realizing the futility of endless territorial struggles, voluntarily left their stone palaces. They removed heavy gold ornaments, donned simple garments made of tree bark, and retreated into remote forests. In the quiet of distant groves, hidden beneath the canopies of ancient trees, far from trade routes and military camps, a new philosophical thought began to take shape. The lifestyle of forest hermits differed markedly from that of city dwellers. The residents of ashrams lived on wild roots, fruits, and pure spring water, deliberately rejecting the luxuries of a declining era. Their focus gradually shifted from the external fire altar to the inner fire of knowledge. In previous centuries, religious practice had centered on grand state sacrifices, where hundreds of priests chanted hymns for days to appease celestial rulers. It was believed that the gods would generously reward people with rains, bountiful harvests, and victories over enemies in exchange for abundant offerings. The construction of altars required precise mathematical calculations, and even a slight error in mantra pronunciation could bring disaster upon the entire family commissioning the ritual. The priestly caste monopolized access to higher powers, turning spiritual life into a complex bureaucratic system inaccessible to ordinary people. However, the forest sages began to ask different questions. They realized that material benefits gained from external rituals brought only temporary satisfaction. Conquered kingdoms inevitably fell apart, accumulated wealth passed to heirs, and the physical body inevitably aged and decayed. Drawing on ancient Indian epics and Purana texts, this period laid the foundations of secret teachings known as the Upanishads. The word itself means sitting at the feet of the teacher. Knowledge ceased to be a public spectacle and became an intimate dialogue between mentor and prepared student. In the shade of sprawling banyan trees, thinkers first began to explore the nature of consciousness itself, seeking the root cause of human suffering. Ancient forest academies became analytical centers where a new ethics was developed. "Look at this flame," an old teacher would say to his students, gathered around a small evening fire. The external fire can consume wood and turn it to ash, but there is another fire burning within each of us. It is the flame of awareness, capable of burning away ignorance and freeing the mind from illusions. True sacrifice is not made by pouring ghee on a brick altar, but by surrendering selfish desires in the fire of self-knowledge. Early Upanishadic texts clearly articulate the concept of soul transmigration and the unyielding law of karma. Previously, karma referred solely to the correct performance of ritual actions. Now, the term took on a comprehensive meaning. The sages declared that every action, every spoken word, and even every hidden thought leaves an invisible imprint on the subtle body of a person. These imprints shape future destiny, causing a living being to return again and again to the material world. The cause of this endless cycle of births was not anger from higher powers, but the individual's uncontrolled desires. As long as the mind clings to the results of its labor, as long as it craves wealth, power, or fame, it continues to generate new karma. Breaking this chain was possible only through complete detachment and realization of the illusory nature of the material world. This concept revolutionized the minds of contemporaries, completely devaluing former ideals of warrior valor and limitless accumulation of resources. This shift from ritualism to deep self-analysis marked the maturation of human thought. People stopped blaming external circumstances or the displeasure of gods for their misfortunes. The path to liberation now lay through profound self-knowledge and strict control over one's own emotions. The hermits practiced complex breathing exercises, long meditations, and vows of silence, exploring the hidden reserves of the human psyche. They sought a point of support, not in the changing external world, but within themselves. Torn apart by political conflicts, they sought stability, not in the changing external world, but in the unchanging inner essence they called the Atman. The ideas developed in forest hermitages gradually spread back into the cities. Wandering ascetics brought new concepts to palace squares, sparking heated debates among the educated classes and compelling priests to reconsider their doctrines. Some rulers, impressed by the depth of this knowledge, became disciples of the forest sages themselves, attempting to combine governance with the pursuit of truth. Historical records mention kings who organized grand philosophical debates at their courts, generously rewarding the winners with herds of cattle and gold. This intellectual breakthrough laid a philosophical foundation that helped part of society maintain clarity of mind amid the approaching crisis. New ethical principles based on non-violence, truthfulness, and self-control proved more resilient than state laws or impregnable fortress walls. These ideas influenced all subsequent world philosophies, forever altering the course of humanity's spiritual development. Social transformations of this era deeply affected the institution of family and marriage, especially among the ruling class. Among the warrior caste, marital unions lost their original sacred meaning and became pragmatic tools for political influence, territorial expansion, and military alliances. Where once the union of man and woman was seen as a harmonious merging of two lineages to continue traditions and perform rituals together, calculation and the desire for dominance now took precedence. Monarchs began evaluating potential brides based on the number of war elephants, fertile fields, gold mines, and trade routes they could bring as dowries. Wedding ceremonies turned into prolonged negotiations among treasurers and military commanders, discussing the benefits of state mergers. It is traditionally believed that the ancient practice of Svayamvara gave princesses full freedom to choose a husband from among invited guests. Spacious amphitheatres adorned with flower garlands and silk tents were built for this rite. The royal maiden would step into the centre and place a garland around the neck of the suitor she deemed most worthy. However, in this period, this custom was gradually replaced by strict dynastic agreements. Fathers and rulers predetermined roles, concluded secret pacts, and decided winners long before the ceremony began. Often the Svayamvara was merely a pretext for demonstrating military power or outright abducting the bride. Among the warrior class, the forceful taking of a princess in front of bewildered rivals became a supreme display of valor and unwavering character. A striking example of this approach is the story of the mighty warrior Bhishma from the Kuru clan. Upon arriving at the Svayamvara of the ruler of Kashi, he did not wait for the decision of the three princesses, Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika. Bhishma challenged all the present kings to battle, defeated their armies, and carried the princesses away on his heavy chariot to marry them to his ailing half-brother. "My bow will crush anyone who dares to challenge my right," Bhishma declared to the outraged monarchs, drawing his bowstring. The law of the warrior caste states that a bride taken by force of arms is the most valuable prize, and I claim these maidens for the glory of Hastinapura. Such actions, vividly described in the epic Mahabharata, clearly illustrate how royal women became hostages of political alliances. They were handed over to foreign houses to secure peace treaties, keep vassals in submission, or as compensation for damages caused by border skirmishes. Viewing women as valuable resources inevitably led to hidden resentments, destructive intrigues, and blood feuds within palace walls. Princesses, torn from their homes and married against their will to elderly rulers or infirm heirs, brought bitterness and disappointment to their new families. The same Princess Amba, whose fate was shattered by Bhishma's actions, spent her remaining years in forest retreats, performing ascetic practices, driven by a single desire: to settle scores with her captor. Her hatred was so intense that she willingly left this life and was reborn in her next incarnation as a warrior named Shikandi to fulfill her vow on the battlefield. Palace chambers became invisible battlegrounds where rejected wives wove conspiracies, bribed palace guards, hired informants, and eliminated rivals with poisons, clearing the path to the throne for their own sons. Complex, tangled kinship ties among ruling houses created a highly dangerous and unstable geopolitical situation across the continent. Monarchs actively practiced polygamy, marrying women from dozens of neighbouring states to expand their spheres of influence. As a result, each ruler found themselves bound by mutual oaths, financial debts, and marital obligations to many other kings, who often openly fought among themselves. Any local territorial dispute, a quarrel over grazing rights on borderlands, or control of a river crossing for toll collection, could instantly draw dozens of independent states into conflict. Diplomats constantly travelled between capitals, reminding rulers of old agreements and demanding the fulfillment of alliance duties. If one monarch decided to punish a rebellious neighbour, he sent armed messengers to his numerous in-laws, demanding immediate military support as close relatives. Refusal to provide war chariots or infantry was seen as public dishonour and a cause for new blood feuds. Thus, the system of dynastic marriages, originally designed as a reliable mechanism to restrain aggression and ensure lasting peace, became its complete opposite. It turned into a vast trap where the slightest spark at the border could trigger a chain reaction, leading to a large-scale war of total destruction. The rulers of this age found themselves prisoners of their own diplomatic intrigues, hopelessly entangled in the web of obligations they had woven over generations. The rapid rise in geopolitical tension led these states into an unprecedented arms buildup. Rulers could no longer rely solely on large infantry, armed with ordinary bronze swords or units of war elephants. Maintaining a regular army supplied with provisions, horses, and wagons became only a basic requirement for survival. Real superiority on the battlefield now depended on access to technologies of a completely different order. Outstanding warriors, princes, and commanders voluntarily left their stone palaces and ventured into the remote mountain regions of the Himalayas. There they dedicated decades to grueling ascetic practices, subjecting their bodies to extreme trials. They spent months standing in icy mountain rivers, fasting and foregoing sleep, focusing their minds. Their primary goal was to gain access to divine weapons, known in the Vedic tradition as astras. The nature of these weapons was fundamentally different from ordinary physical arms. Astras were not forged in craftsmen's workshops, nor kept in typical armories guarded by soldiers. The destructive power of these artifacts was activated not by physical strength, but through the utterance of specific sound vibrations. Mastery of an astra required the ability to concentrate one's inner energy and channel it by reciting a secret mantra, instantly unleashing dormant natural forces. The Mahabharata epic and various Puranas provide detailed descriptions of how such weapons operated, astonishing in their scale. For example, the water weapon could unleash devastating floods, capable of drowning enemy fortifications and sweeping away entire battalions. Meanwhile, the fire weapon would unleash a wall of all-consuming flames that melted armour. The transmission of knowledge about the mantras was strictly controlled. Forest mentors and gurus taught the art of wielding divine weapons only to those students who could prove their ability to control their own emotions and desires. However, a special place in the arsenals of ancient armies was held by the Brahmastra, a weapon of mass destruction whose use was considered a last resort and strictly regulated by ancient codes of warfare. Historical texts describe its effect as the release of blinding energy, capable of destroying entire regions, instantly evaporating deep freshwater reservoirs and poisoning the soil for many generations. People caught in its range lost their sight and their ability to reproduce. The possession of such a weapon by rulers served as a key deterrent in political negotiations. Kings fully understood that an open clash between two armies armed with the Brahmastra would inevitably lead to mutual destruction, not only of the opposing sides, but also of the entire surrounding biosphere. Awareness of this global threat forced monarchs to tread carefully, continuously expanding their secret arsenals out of fear of being defenseless before a better prepared neighbour who might break the unspoken non-aggression pact. The concentration of such destructive power in the hands of the ruling class, whose morality had been significantly weakened by the fading era, posed a direct threat to the very existence of the planet. Endless military mobilizations, massive deforestation for siege engine construction, depletion of mines, and pollution of rivers led to serious disruption of the natural balance. According to ancient legends, the earth, unable to bear the weight of thousands of armies, military camps, and the excessive pride of arrogant rulers, took on the form of a weary, weeping cow. In this form, it left the material world and ascended to the higher realms of the cosmos to seek help from Vishnu, the guardian of universal balance. Quote 2. The earth declared, bowing before the divine throne. Quote 3. The response of the higher powers to this sincere plea determined the course of human history. Vishnu promised the earth that he would soon incarnate in human form to restore the lost order and free the planet from the burden of militaristic empires. The process of karmic accumulation had reached a critical mass. Every wrong decision of the monarchs, every use of divine weapons for personal gain, every destroyed village, and every breach of hospitality laws weighed heavily on the collective fate of humanity. Society during the Dvapara Yuga found itself at an impasse where accumulated social and political contradictions could no longer be resolved through peaceful negotiations, trade agreements, or local territorial concessions. A global cleansing was required, a massive social upheaval capable of dismantling outdated political institutions and physically eliminating those who wielded supreme power solely for personal enrichment and the subjugation of neighbouring peoples. The mechanism of cosmic retribution was fully set in motion, and all participants in the geopolitical game began inexorably moving toward their bloody finale, destined to unfold on the vast plains of northern India. The epicenter of the coming upheaval was to be Hastinapura. In this powerful state, a severe succession crisis erupted, dividing the once unified ruling family into two warring factions, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. This conflict was not a random occurrence or a local quarrel over tax collection rights in a distant province. It was the inevitable result of the development of society during the Dvapara Yuga, the critical point at which all unresolved contradictions of the fading era converged. The imperial capital impressed contemporaries with its architectural splendor. White stone multi-level palaces rose above the full banks of the Ganges. Wide avenues were paved with smooth basalt slabs, and city markets overflowed with goods from all corners of the world. The state treasury was regularly replenished by tributes from subordinate kings, providing the court with an unprecedented level of luxury. Yet beneath this outward prosperity and strict adherence to etiquette lay a deep moral decay among the elite. At the head of the state was King Dhritarashtra, whose physical blindness perfectly mirrored his inner inability to soberly assess the political situation and control the growing ambitions of his own sons. His eldest son, Duryodhana, absorbed from an early age the poisoned atmosphere of permissiveness. He saw state power solely as a tool to satisfy personal desires and suppress rivals, rather than as a heavy responsibility to protect his subjects. Texts mention how, year after year, the rhetoric within the palace walls changed. The wisdom of the elders, which had once served as an unshakable guide for difficult decisions, began to be questioned and openly mocked by the younger generation. The old advisors, who remembered the era of righteous rulers, regularly tried to reason with the heirs to the throne, but their quiet voices were drowned out by the chorus of selfish flatterers and aggressive generals. Duryodhana skillfully manipulated his blind father's love, repeatedly forcing the old monarch to make decisions directly contradicting the laws of universal harmony. The story of the feud among the descendants of the great King Kuru serves as a perfect example of how rigid adherence to the letter of the law can completely destroy its original spirit. The climax of this legalized hypocrisy was the fateful game of dice held in the main hall of Hastinapura. This event marks a key turning point in the final moral decline of the ruling elite. A game that in ancient times had a sacred character and was used by rulers to distribute landholdings with the involvement of higher powers, turned into a tool of deceit. The Kauravas, relying on the cheating tactics of their uncle Shakuni, methodically, throw after throw, deprived the Pandavas of state property, personal wealth, royal titles, and even their freedom. The most frightening aspect of this event was the grave silence of the elite. Not a single respected Brahmin, renowned general, or noble guest present in the vast hall stopped the unfolding injustice. Each found a convenient excuse for inaction in complex legal interpretations. Some cited the strict rules governing gambling, others recalled unbreakable oaths of loyalty to the reigning monarch. Still others simply feared provoking the wrath of Duryodhana's powerful faction. Japtha 4 declared the court scribes coldly, watching as the rightful heirs to the throne were stripped of their last rights. The dice had been cast voluntarily, the stakes accepted openly, and therefore the results could not be challenged under any circumstances. In this tense situation, neither family ties nor diplomatic efforts of kings held any sway. After their defeat, the Pandavas were forced to leave the capital and embark on a long 13-year exile. They left behind a prosperous kingdom in the hands of those lacking any moral restraint. The years spent by the rightful heirs in the forest did nothing to soften the hearts of the usurpers. On the contrary, the Kauravas used this time to strengthen their hold on power, forge military alliances with neighbouring states, and massively increase their combat strength. They formed regular armies, recruiting the finest warriors with generous land grants and gold. When the long exile finally came to an end, the Pandavas made one last attempt to resolve the conflict through negotiation. They sent authorized envoys to Hastinapura with a proposal for a reasonable compromise, offering to relinquish claims to the vast empire in exchange for control over just 5 small villages. This unprecedented gesture clearly showed their sincere desire to avoid bloodshed among their people. However, Duryodhana, intoxicated by absolute power and confident in the invincibility of his legions, categorically rejected any peace initiatives. __quote_5__, the ruler arrogantly declared, severing the last threads of diplomacy. __6__. At this moment, society crossed an invisible line, beyond which maintaining the familiar political order was no longer possible. Decades of accumulated grievances, broken agreements, and an insatiable thirst for absolute power outweighed the basic instinct of self-preservation for entire peoples. The shadow of Hastinapura rapidly spread over neighbouring states, forcing each independent ruler of the Vedic world to make a difficult personal choice and send troops to support one side or the other. The era of compromise ended, giving way to inevitable confrontation. When diplomatic missions finally failed, vast armies from all corners of the Vedic continent began converging on the sacred plain of Kurukshetra. The site for the upcoming battle was chosen for several objective reasons. Ancient texts describe this expansive plain as a place long designated for grand sacrifices and ascetic practices. The land was considered sacred, and any warrior who gave his life there was believed to ascend directly to higher realms. The roads leading to Kurukshetra quickly filled with endless columns of troops. Chariots, heavy war elephants, infantry, and cavalry covered the plain as far as the eye could see, forming massive military camps. The infrastructure of these camps was impressive in its scale and organisation. Spacious tents were erected for commanders, with separate rooms for rest, strategic meetings, and weapons storage. Temporary dirt roads were laid between rows of tents, field kitchens were set up to feed hundreds of thousands daily, and hospitals were prepared for the wounded. Large enclosures housed draft animals. Merchants and craftsmen continuously supplied food, drinking water, spare parts for broken wheels, and new arrows, ensuring the smooth operation of this war machine. The air was filled with the neighing of horses, the trumpeting of elephants, and the ringing of blacksmiths forging armour. Rulers of all known states were compelled to make their final choice and join one side or the other. The dynastic dispute between two branches of the same family escalated into a global military conflict, drawing almost the entire Vedic world into its orbit. Lords of southern territories, leaders of forest tribes, and kings of eastern provinces brought their regular armies, bound by old systems of agreements, marriage alliances, and vassal oaths. As a result, close relatives found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. Brothers marched against brothers, and disciples prepared to raise arms against their mentors. The warrior's duty forced people to ignore family ties and long-standing friendships. My bow refuses to serve me when I see among the enemy ranks those on whose knees I grew up, said one renowned leader, surveying the orderly rows of opposing infantry. What use is a kingdom if its acquisition requires shedding the blood of one's own teachers and close kin? Such heavy doubts tormented many commanders during the long hours waiting for the first blast of conch shells, signalling the start of battle. People understood that the victor would inherit only devastated lands and the bitterness of irreparable losses. Analysing ancient treatises reveals that this confrontation was not merely a large-scale historical battle for territory and influence. The text described the events at Kurukshetra as a complex cosmological act of universal purification. The conflict was designed by higher powers to mark the end of an entire historical era, the Dvapara Yuga. The planet, burdened by the weight of millions of soldiers, military bases and monarchs' ambitions, needed relief from its accumulated load. The battlefield transformed into a vast sacrificial altar. In the flames of this battle, all the negative karma of humanity was to be burned away. Swords, spears, and destructive celestial weapons were merely instruments in the hands of relentless time, erasing militaristic empires and rulers who had long forgotten their true purpose: to protect their subjects and uphold Dharma. Under extreme tension and the collapse of all familiar social norms, individuals faced the necessity of completely rethinking their role in the universe. When the familiar world collapses and diplomatic tactics lose all meaning, only the pure essence of human nature remains. The wars at Kurukshetra tested the spirit to its limits. The loss of comrades and the constant presence of danger forced every participant to seek new inner strength. Former rituals aimed at appeasing the gods for material prosperity lost all relevance amid the hail of arrows and the thunder of racing chariots. The complex system of social orders, which in peaceful times clearly regulated each member's duties, faced the harshest trial on the battlefield. Priests took up arms, breaking their vows of non-violence, while warriors engaged in deep philosophical reflection, usually reserved for scholars. This blending of social roles and erosion of established boundaries revealed a profound systemic crisis. The old rules ceased to function, and new ones had yet to form. Humanity found itself at a point of no return. The massive bloodshed served as a mechanism for restoring universal balance. The pride of kings who had amassed great wealth and imagined themselves equal to the creators was broken through days of fierce conflict. Vedic civilization could never return to its previous way of life. The surviving rulers inherited ruined provinces, a shattered economy, and grieving cities. This painful process of cleansing demanded the creation of an entirely new ethics and principles of governance, where the fleeting nature of material achievements and the inevitability of consequences for every decision would be foremost. Thus, beneath the heavy skies of Kurukshetra, among armies frozen in anticipation, unfolded the greatest philosophical dialogue known to the world, the Bhagavad Gita. The era of Dvapara Yuga, where righteousness stood like a wounded bull of Dharma on only two legs, reached its logical conclusion. The entire history of this time clearly demonstrates how small concessions to one's conscience accumulate over time, growing into an overwhelming force that sweeps away entire civilizations. The lessons learned from the passing ages teach us that a law devoid of compassion inevitably turns into tyranny. Knowledge pursued solely to satisfy material needs and political ambitions leads society toward inevitable structural collapse. A prolonged period of decline in governing institutions ended with the complete shattering of illusions that a prosperous state could be built on fear and rigid ritual regulation alone. Rulers whose actions brought devastation to the continent came to realize through experience that external rules cannot replace the inner frequency of thought. Although not officially confirmed, many scholars of ancient chronology associate the final transition between eras with a specific astronomical event, the moment when Krishna completed his earthly journey. Until that moment, his presence acted as a restraining force, preventing the destruction of the remaining cosmic order. The ancient texts mention that with his departure, the world lost piety, mercy, and truthfulness. Passing his wisdom to the hesitant warrior Arjuna, Krishna introduced a completely new approach to fulfilling one's duties, which would become a guiding principle for future generations. Within the pages of the Bhagavad Gita, words resonate across millennia. Perform the duty assigned to you, for action is better than inaction. Even maintaining your physical body requires effort. This principle of karma yoga calls for detachment from the results of one's labor, focusing solely on the righteousness of the action itself. After a devastating battle that claimed millions of lives, the Bull of Dharma loses yet another support. Humanity is left to face the consequences of its choices alone. Having lost direct contact with the divine presence and deprived of intuitive understanding of truth, people enter the final and darkest age, Kali Yuga. In this era, in which we still live today, spiritual blindness reaches its peak, and the search for truth demands extraordinary inner strength. But that is a different story altogether, filled with its own mysteries, harsh trials, and hidden meanings. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the depths of ancient history and philosophy. Until we meet again on our You've been watching Ancient Secrets. Thanks for watching and have a great day.